Good morning, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Bonjour, depending on where you are at the border. This is Andy Revkin. I am at the Earth Institute, Columbia University, and I'm running a nascent center initiative on communication and sustainability. The goal is to make information matter. And we live in a very noisy information environment right now. And it's not just disinformation. Sometimes it's just too much information, especially around an urgent ongoing emergency like the coronavirus 19 pandemic. My colleague, Jeff Schlegelmilch at the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at Columbia likes to advise information consumers to develop their own capacity to filter, to think about what you actually need to know today to make the world a little bit better around you, a little bit safer for your friends and family, and to think about the future. Today, we're thinking about the present and the future at the same time. We face a concurrent challenge of making life safe for communities, from the most disadvantaged to those who run things, and at the same time building a better future so we don't maintain this vulnerability, not just to epidemics, but to climate change and other global threats that are emerging in fast forward nature. I'm really pleased today to host, essentially, I'm going to step back as much as I can in this discussion of something that we touched on recently, but haven't put in the foreground. And that's the economy, the value. How do we value in a true concrete way the people who create value around us by sustaining the functionality of society, by providing and producing the goods we all rely on? They're mostly invisible. They're the ones who are on the front lines most. They're the most vulnerable. One of the most powerful op-eds I've ever seen in the New York Times was written by a woman who's a transit worker, a subway worker in New York City, who's also a really good writer. She has a book out, and she wrote a piece saying, we're not essential workers, we're sacrificial workers. And that really stuck in my head as it just shows you some of the imbalances and disregarded factors that we have not yet really grappled with around our situation now and going forward. And we all owe this discussion today to Katie Kish, who had been on a previous program here with Herman Daly and with other young scholars from an emerging network around an economics for the Anthropocene. If you look in the little banner down below, you'll see e4a-net.org. That's a good starting place to get familiar with their thinking and what they're working on. And I'm going to introduce Katie Kish and Katharine Zywert and Sophie Sanniti, who are part of this network and are driving an effort to break disciplinary barriers and build progress. So Katie, I want to turn it over to you first. Good morning. And I also like to check in with just how things are going where you are. So just tell people where you are and what life is like, and then we can get started.
Good morning. Thanks so much, Andy. I'm in Kitchener-Waterloo, which is just west of Toronto. And things here are pretty good. Like Canada's numbers are they're good. They're going down in our region. We're very fortunate to live in a very interesting and exciting city. Katharine and Sophie both live here as well. And at home, we're getting used to it. We're getting into a bit of a groove. It's taken a little bit of time to get there, but it's getting a little bit easier day by day and sort of coming to terms with what this might look like in the long term. So I know Sophie and Katharine, we all did our PhDs I did it, they're still doing it at the University of Waterloo. And we have worked a lot together on ideas around alternative economies and transitions and complex systems and how complex systems evolve and change over time. And so with Katharine working on healthcare and Sophie working on gender and the care economy, and then I work on production and labor and peer-to-peer networks, this was sort of our dream panel to start weaving these ideas together. And so we've brought in 3 experts who we all really admire. We have Susan Polson from the University of Florida, who works on political ecology and gender. Bill Sutherland, he's probably the most interesting doctor I have ever met. But medical doctor. He's the founder of an innovator of the complexity medicine concept and director of the Complexity Medicine Institute. He will have some interesting ideas. And then Michelle Bowens, who's coming in from Thailand and is one of the people whose work I admire the most. He's written most of the modern foundational ideas on peer-to-peer and founded the Peer-to-Peer Foundation. So they'll come in after an introduction on these ideas from the three of us. So I want to thank everyone for doing this and for joining us. And I'm really looking forward to that discussion. And so Sophie is actually going to kick us off.
Sure, I'll go right ahead. So thanks, Katie. I'm here in Waterloo as well, and I'm in the third year of my PhD in social and ecological sustainability. I'd like to start off, I guess, by expressing gratitude to our frontline workers, those providing essential services to keep our society going, as Andy had mentioned. These individuals, often in low-paid and once stigmatized positions, have now become international heroes, as our collective interpretation of essential has shifted quite dramatically. I've been spending my time as a sustainability researcher thinking a lot about the concept of care, because what we're facing isn't just a health or an economic or an environmental crisis, but a crisis in care for people and the planet. We have the caring capacity of our societies, the everyday mundane labor involved to reproduce the individual as a worker, a consumer, a parent, and a citizen on a daily and intergenerational basis. This includes everything from caring for our bodies and our minds to developing a strong sense of ethics and citizenship, key to a society. We also have the carrying capacity of our environment. These are the local ecosystems and the global biosphere constantly at work to clean our air, purify our water, and nourish our soils. These critical reproductive labors of people and planet, labors that maintain the worker outside the factory and ensure a stable climate, remain factors of production not produced, but assumed by mainstream economics. These unpaid and unvalued labors are systematically diverted away from maintaining the necessities of life and towards the stimulation of continued economic growth. And as many critics will argue, rather than a means to an end, growth in the economy has become the end goal itself. Our globalized economic system is therefore incompatible with life on this planet. And the COVID crisis has really exemplified this, revealing all the fractures and inconsistencies and inequalities in our society as we collectively struggle to balance safety and security. The virus has found a fragile host, to quote feminist economist Stephanie Seguino, preying on the most vulnerable in our society, corrupting the most intimate of human experience. We've been instructed to stay home because we care, if indeed we have a home to stay in, where we each have an opportunity to reconsider what caring for each other really means. The global response to the pandemic reveals three extraordinary things that can bring us some hope. The first is that the system of life is an interdependent phenomenon that we humans are fortunate enough to be a part of. Each and every one of us have a vested interest in the health and safety of the entire human community. Indeed, we always have, but it's never been so apparent. From masks to hospital beds to toilet paper, this experience has demonstrated the way we collectively share access, responsibility, burdens, and risks that come with a shared crisis, though certainly the distribution of access and impact remains drastically unequal. Second, that it is indeed possible to radically transform the priorities of our economy if we so choose. The International Labour Organization estimates that lockdown measures have impacted over 80% of the world's workforce and could impose economic repercussions unlike anything we've witnessed in the entire history of capitalism. But these actions and efforts were done consciously to minimize the spread of the virus, which means that we can consciously alter our economic priorities for other efforts like stabilizing our climate or reducing inequality. Third, the global response to the pandemic shows that economics is not and never was about relentless growth and profit margins, but instead is fundamentally about provisioning. Economies are a function of the way societies organize to sustain life, as we have done during the pandemic, prioritizing essential services and workers, and as many traditional societies have done for generations. The pandemic is an environmental response to unrelenting economic pressure on the reproductive capacities of our society and the environment, and thus our approach to heal must be environmentally informed. Across sectors, jurisdictions, politics, and generations, a collection of voices are demanding an equitable and sustainable economic transformation. This will require a dramatic shift in where we're spending and investing our time, money, labor, and resources, supporting efforts that regenerate, maintain, repair, and restore life as we shift towards a more careful world. Thank you for the opportunity to engage in this conversation, and I look forward to hearing more from the other speakers.
Thank you so much, Sophie. Eloquent and interesting as always. So I'm going to give a little bit of an intro and background to peer-to-peer and open source now, and then Katharine will talk about health. So I want to start by thinking back to some of the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, when we saw that information and knowledge, whether it was shared or withheld, is key to the success of global and national responses to this. We witnessed that closed intellectual property rights can create really big problems regarding critical life-saving items, such as 3M's many patents preventing others from producing masks. Intellectual property of that kind of nature has always been rationalized under neoliberal economics, but the inhumanity of it was really exposed. When we talk about peer-to-peer, we're describing kinds of relational networks that empower an open commons mode of production and knowledge generation. In some ways, peer-to-peer substitutes for local relationships that we lost during the process of globalization. And now, despite being a global community, we can all still work together through different peer-to-peer networks. There's sometimes a debate in ecological economics, which is where the three of us come from, about global versus local, but peer-to-peer empowers both of those. Peer-to-peer is open access, so this is a practice where designs and knowledge, they're available freely through open licenses. People can still use those to sell and manufacture goods for a profit, but without the arguably unethical rents from intellectual property. It can't be privatized, so you don't get the same kinds of monopolies and profit-driven growth motives that have created extreme inequality and environmental devastation. I've long been a proponent of mainly distributed manufacturing, but also open source knowledge and peer-to-peer, which helps support that, as they all empower individuals and communities while embodying an ethic that relates and corresponds to core values in both ecology and in care. Our current knowledge economy and innovation processes do not enhance the well-being of humanity or the planet. Production and innovation, they follow patterns for the sake of profit and growth rather than for need or for what people are needing. On the other hand, the peer-to-peer community responds to the needs of the community instead of taking advantage of it. So open knowledge is iterative. People can learn and grow together while also lowering the threshold for participation required to participate in the generation of knowledge. So it's equitable and it's democratic. Peer-to-peer is inherently caring in some ways, as it's based on reciprocity and sharing rather than extraction. In academia, we have a very funny view on knowledge. There's endless worries about someone gaining from an idea that we produced. But what if we included knowledge in our quality of life indicators, ease of access to it, collaborative creation of it, and how it improves the human-earth relationship, rather than thinking about knowledge as something that we own? Peer-to-peer builds on humanity's altruistic and cooperative and caring nature as a mode of relationship that allows individuals to connect and to collaborate, produce, and share without barrier or gain beyond a collective pro-social evolution. So the pandemic has really demonstrated the need for open source knowledge systems, and we can learn a lot from the efforts that have emerged in response to the pandemic. For example, very early on, open access schematics and files became quickly available to share with people who had access to 3D printers to help produce local personal protective equipment. And if the designs weren't quite perfect or they weren't working, people changed them and then shared it again freely. Same goes for patterns and designs for masks, fabric masks. And not only has all of that information been given out for free, but then people started making 3D printed and handicrafted PPE and giving it away for free. Donations even from larger companies came pouring in, and people in my community, and I know in other places in Kitchener-Waterloo and across Canada at least, people started to hang masks from trees saying, take one if you need one. Online, folks started popping up, offering to help one another however they could. People are geographically quite separated, but technically very, very close. And so they've been able to connect people to those that can help others the best. The peer-to-peer community was not only able to quickly respond to the needs of the community, they did so without asking for anything in return. So if we look forward into the future of what it could look like, we can imagine peer-to-peer food systems connecting farmers with those in need of food, of healthy foods, health networks of people helping people, more peer-to-peer goods sharing networks. I'm already in personally about 10 parent sharing groups, but most of those are through a company that makes a profit off of our peer-to-peer networks. And skill sharing and distributed production that replaces some of our global trade needs. So if we hope to foster capacity, to reestablish control over production and knowledge, instead of becoming or remaining, I guess, passive victims to neoliberalism, we need to bring back into the very heart of our culture respect for what makes us human, cooperation and care and creativity. We've devalued these in favor of growth and knowledge for profit. So by embracing the peer-to-peer community, we can shift from resilience, the ability to recover, to an anti-fragility, that is to thrive as a result of stressors. The peer-to-peer and the commons equip communities with systems of knowledge transfer and development that can increase our capacity to address problems as they pop up, even if we don't know what they are. Before the pandemic, we didn't know what we would need, but the peer-to-peer community, the makers and the retoolers, they filled our needs so quickly and freely because the infrastructure to help was already in place, and they were already a part of an economy that prioritizes caring and collective well-being. So through cooperative knowledge generation, which is often in these communities stimulated by playful curiosity and trust and reciprocity, we can be more equipped to confront other inevitable crises. So Katharine is now going to do a similar background introduction on health that Sophie and I have just done for care and peer-to-peer.
Great, thanks, Katie and Sophie. And as you've already introduced those two topics, I'm going to focus on health and what the shift toward a pro-social health system might look like from the perspective of local self-organization in the context of a broader transition toward a post-growth world. Of course, we can't know at this point what the long-term implications of the global economic slowdown that we're currently living through are going to be for health, but we can look at some historical examples and also what is emerging in the current context to understand how we might cope. Most people in the general population probably assume that growth, well-being, and health are all tied together and can't be untied. But in fact, there's quite a lot of counterintuitive dynamics that are involved in the relationship between health and growth. And I'm going to provide two examples and then talk about some of the things that are currently happening in the context of the pandemic. So during the Great Depression, you might expect that this was bad for health, but paradoxically, we actually saw life expectancies rising during this time, and rates of disease and mortality fell across age cohorts, social groups, and genders. And this, the hypothesis is that this was because people were exposed to less industrial pollutants, less workplace accidents, and there was a slower pace of life that allowed for deeper social connections. And a similar pattern was also observed during Cuba's special period, when basically overnight imports of fossil fuels, medical technologies, and pharmaceuticals, and lots of foreign agricultural products just disappeared. And the nation as a whole was forced to retool into a much more labor-intensive as opposed to industrial system. And so in healthcare, this counterintuitively resulted in rising life expectancies, declining deaths from things like diabetes, heart disease, and stroke. And mostly this was because people were forced out of necessity to eat less processed foods, more locally produced foods, and also to have much more active lifestyles. But of course, for people living through these two crises, they didn't necessarily experience them as easy or very positive. It was an extremely difficult time. And what we see also is that subjective well-being is highly sensitive to declining growth. So while increasing GDP or income doesn't really add a lot to people's quality of life as reported in subjective well-being, if cross-country comparisons show that if economies are declining and people have less income, they tend to be less happy. And so even though economic crises can paradoxically be good for health based on these objective measures like life expectancy and disease burden, it doesn't necessarily mean people are going to feel good about that. So in the context of the pandemic, I think it's important to ask ourselves what we can do to bolster health and well-being at the population level, given that people are going to experience the socioeconomic impacts of the pandemic as quite difficult. And this is where I think a peer-to-peer approach to health comes in. If we think about health systems as complex systems, we can see that they display patterns of self-organization. And there's quite a lot of this going on in response to the pandemic. Some of my favorite examples are the neighborhood pods and mutual aid groups that have sprung up all across Europe and North America to care for the most vulnerable people within communities and make sure that they have access to all of their essential needs, things like groceries and medications. And there has also been a huge interest in the relocalization of supply chains, particularly around food, motivated by a focus on health. And of course, we don't know what will become of these pandemic gardens and if they will make a meaningful difference in food supply chains, but people do seem to be genuinely engaged in this process of skill building and forming new connections and sharing at the community level. Here in Kitchener, there's someone who has decided to use the time and money that they're receiving through the relief benefit to build raised beds for all of their neighbors, which is quite exciting and I think in line with the kinds of initiatives we want to encourage. Clearly, government investments into universal health care and public health and emergency medicine are also essential. But I think that we can imagine some kind of modular system that includes all of these things and also that leverages community networks in more meaningful ways. So I'll finish up by saying that if we see any potential for this COVID experience to tip us toward a post-growth world, we should be trying to support the kinds of approaches to population health that are emerging at a local scale between networks of neighbors, family, and friends. Because these things are not only good for health, but they give people a sense of meaning and connection. And this will help to mitigate some of the more negative psychological impacts of the shift toward a post-growth world. And I believe Bill is going to talk a little bit about a relational approach to what health looks like on the ground. So I'm, as always, really looking forward to that and to hearing all the other speakers. Thanks for including me in this.
That was a great introduction from all of you. I'm going to dip back out in a second so we can have all three of the guests on screen. I wanted to offer one observation, well, two. First, the other thing, when you look at people's gauges of happiness, I liked what you said, Katharine, about that finding about subjective accounts of your perception of well-being tend to be negative in a dip in the economy. But the other thing that people find their source of well-being and through their connectedness in a community, that's a very strong indicator of their sense of overall well-being also too. So that connectedness at the local level, I think, has a huge upside benefit. The one thing on the flip side, though, and I'm not a techno optimist, but I kind of straddle these worlds, and I love that how technology has facilitated what Katie was talking about, the ability of people to use a 3D printer, for example, to share technology and get things done across great distances but who made the 3D printer? And 3M, I met an executive there once in sustainability who described 3M's internal process. They're sort of like Google. They give employees 20% of their time to just think. And the Post-it note, which is not exactly a life-saving, world-changing technology, but the Post-it note came about because a guy was looking for a solvent-free sticky thing. How can you be sticky without toxic solvents? And he was doing that on his spare time that came through the wealth accumulated at 3M to make sure its employees had time to think. So it feels like sometimes it's complicated. Katie, maybe Katie and Katharine, one quick round of thoughts on that, and Sophie, before we go to the guests.
Yeah, I mean, when I did my PhD dissertation on makers and making and 3D printing and this sort of thing, and making is interesting because it helps empower, it gives people higher self-esteem, and when they have access to things open source, it makes it easier to make. And so that was the mainstream that I took. But I did we did a workshop where we built a power cube with this group called Open Source Ecology. They're quite cool. And so it was 2 or 3 days of learning to weld. And anyway, we had to go, the whole point was to build this battery that would run something. We had to pop out to Home Depot, like which is a Canadian hardware store. Maybe it's American too. We had to pop out 4 or 5 or 6 times a day to get things that we needed to build our homemade battery. So it was definitely not homemade and homegrown. And so there is a little bit, and this is why I said somewhere in what I was talking about it impacting some of our production, right? We're still going to need to have, and I think this is good, because if it impacts a little bit of the production, we still need global supply chains to some extent. And that's a good thing, I think, because if we cut them down entirely, then we become insular countries again, and that can create a lot of different kinds of problems. But by still relying on each other to empower our homemade production and distributed manufacturing, it can actually be beneficial.
And this gets to the grand trend. This was what we talked about with Herman Daly and Kate Rayworth too, is the transition question, which is again what we're getting. We are embedded in a systemic, globally supplied economy now, and it's the hardest thing I think to think about is how do you make the transition, and that's why this discussion today is so great. This was a paper that some people at Columbia University at the Earth Institute contributed to that basically did a pretty thorough, and it could be seen as discouraging, depending on your point of view, analysis of where in the world you have the potential to be not local, to be local, and it's a third of the world, at least according to this study, for a long time to come. So we're kind of like, I think it'll end up being this hybrid kind of iterative push going forward. But I don't want to waste more time in this round, and I want to get back to you and your guests. So I'm going to pop off here. I'll be available. You can kind of text me through that message thing and bring in your marvelous, I won't call them mentors. This is all co-learning. I think, I hate it when people think of me as someone to come to because I've had 35 years of experience writing about climate change, because I'm still learning every day too. So here they come, and I'm going to say goodbye for a bit.
Great. Thank you so much again, Andy. So I think we'll go through our the topics in the same order. Our guests are going to give us around 10 minutes of thoughts. Sophie, Katharine, and I know that these ideas link somehow, like we intuitively know it. And so we're hoping you can help us make some of those links. And so we'll start with Susan.
Morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Good. All right. Wonderful. It's great to see Katharine, Katie, and Sophie just about a year after they organized an ecological economics conference, which did an incredibly thoughtful approach to collaborative learning about and through care, common knowledge, provisioning, which was great. And it was an extremely bodily experience. We had chants and prayers, dancing together, sharing food. In terms of an intellectual conference, I thought it was really powerful in that sense of creating a common body, making together. We had a making space. And I admire you three so much to push now with these same understandings in a way where we can't be bodily together and we have to invent different ways of learning and knowing. And I think that's really admirable. So basically, I just want to sort of put a challenge to the three of you and to everybody to think about strategies for institutionalizing some of these initiatives and linking them. So I think basically, let's think on maybe 3 scales or temporal spatial moments. One is what we do in our daily practice. One are sort of policies that we can make, government, local, corporate policies that support different daily practices and institutional changes. And the third, which I think is probably most powerful historically, are social cultural systems, economies, production systems, religions, gender systems, kinship systems, right, that are sort of underlying all of this. So what I'm hearing from you guys, from each of you, are very nice, tangible examples of ways to change daily practices. Katharine's talking about neighborhood care groups, mental and physical health support in these COVID moments. Katie talks about people making together masks or PPE. Sophie's talking about changes in household-based caring. So we've got these daily sort of practices and skills and innovations that are emerging in this moment. And I would like to ask everybody to think, what kind of policies can be put in place to support those to continue and strengthen? And what necessary for social cultural institutions to actually change in ways that value and promote those kind of initiatives you're talking about, and that would work through kinship and gender and religion to produce humans and human relationships that valued care, physical and mental health, commoning, rather than private competition. So it's the scale challenge I'm laying out to you. That's enough for me.
Thanks so much, Susan. And actually, it's interesting that you brought this up. Sophie and I actually just started putting together this policy document. We started it about 6 weeks ago now, through our colleagues and friends in the Economics for the Anthropocene program and the new Leadership for the Ecozoic program. All of the research that we're doing, we started to put them into these, I think we have maybe a dozen themes around, there's food and healthcare and production and a bunch of different things, and then 3 scales of policy that relate to those. And the difficult part we're finding is finding policies that make sense to the researcher, that they can say, oh yes, that actually will get us somewhere, that also can go to a policymaker and they'll look at it and think, oh yes, that's actually something that's a reasonable request. And that's, I think, been our hardest challenge with that. But we are trying, and we are working on things like that. So I have some, maybe we can talk more about that later. Michelle.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you to invite me. And I'm speaking from Chiang Mai in Thailand. And for the people who don't know me, I'm the founder of the P2P Foundation. It's an observatory of peer-to-peer and commons-oriented practices. So I'd like to maybe respond to the challenges posed by Susan and give some examples of what could be done in the policy field first, and maybe later I can then touch on institutions. So one of the things that we notice and that Katie mentioned in her introduction is this extraordinary mobilization of unpaid volunteering when faced with market and state failure. Open source communities and maker communities have been trying to compensate for the lack. And I just want to mention this. I'm living here in East Asia, and I'm really puzzled by what I see, because most of the countries here are doing very well. They have 4 out of a million casualties instead of 400, which is the average in some European countries. And one of the reasons is they were prepared. So from the get-go, they reacted very early. They had masks for everyone. They had testing. They had contact tracing. And so they had much more mild confinement needs, because they could actually identify the people who had to be isolated. And so then you see the situation in Europe, which is really catastrophic, and nothing is ready. Even after 7 weeks, there's no mask, there's no testing, there's hardly any contact tracing. Anyway, but so one of the things that we see were missing was a legitimation process, because then you have all these people coming with new designs and old designs. But there's a very fearful reaction by some people in the institutions, because they fear litigation. There's all kinds of, and so this is a big lack that we see today. And so the answer to this, for me, is something we can learn from Italy, which before COVID, Bologna introduced the Bologna regulation for the care and regeneration of the urban commons. And they had 30 projects the first year, 100 the second, 300 the third, and 250 Italian cities are now doing this and mobilizing 1 million people doing urban commoning in a legitimate way. And that's very important because even Ostrom, she was very clear on this, that for successful commons, you need an agreement with public authorities because they can close you if they don't agree for all kinds of reasons. And so this is called public commons cooperation protocols. That would be the concept I would use for this. And I think this is the time to push that for the makers. So we need something similar to what Bologna has done for urban commoners. We now need a generic public commons process that can legitimize this flow of open designs into the medical systems. This is not as unrealistic as you may think, because actually in France, this is already going on. So there's the public hospitals of the Ile-de-France region, the region around Paris, who has already instituted on their own such a process. So where the makers can actually, present their work and have it validated by experts, and then it can be made. And it really helps if you have, government agencies helping. So in Brussels, I have a friend who is a board member, actually, the P2P Foundation, and it took them 1 week to produce, in a really massive way, masks for the local population. And they had 15 obstruction points, so all kinds of people making it difficult for this to happen. But because they had a green government in the region, it actually was smoothened out. And so in a week, it was all done. Okay, so this is one thing. And I don't want to take too much time, so I'll just bring one more point right now, which is a very generic point. And it's really about value. And I want just to briefly take an example from the medical sector. So you have 3 nurses. One is a volunteer with Mother Teresa. She doesn't count in our GDP. She gets some money through philanthropy and donations. She doesn't get a wage. She is value neutral. Then we have the nurse in a governmental hospital in the public sector. She's negative. She costs money. And then only the nurses working in a private hospital, is co-creating capitalization and profits. She will be considered to be a positive value creation. So this is really our problem in the current political economy, is that value is only recognized when it's extractive, when it's about exploiting resources or getting a profit out of commodity labor. And that has a very important consequence. That means that every generative, regenerative, caring activity is marginalized by design. So this is where we really need to work on this. We need to work on how can we value directly care work, regenerative work. I just want to give you one idea of how this could be done, and just to have the thinking process around this. You're probably familiar with distributed ledgers, and I think this is a very important invention, because accounting is how we see the world. So every transaction in the accounting system represents a real provisioning act in the real physical world. And so the fact that we are able to share across an ecosystem open, contributive, flow-based accounting, I think is really important. So I want to give an example how this could work. And I think in New York, there's already a legislative proposal that goes in that direction. So imagine there's the following situation. We have a community land trust in France. It's buying up land and giving ecological contracts with organic farmers so they can have cheap rents in exchange for doing organic agriculture. these people have calculated already a few years ago that their activity was saving the French state through its depollution activities 300 million euros a year. So imagine you have a distributed ledger with a legal agreement, a political decision that this is important for society. For example, decarbonization. This would allow any citizen to say, to basically have its generative activity registered, and on the other side you would have then circular financing. So all the institutions and corporations profiting from these generative externalities would basically share the costs of this, and also of course the government could fund directly the idea of decarbonization. And this would have a lot of advantages because it gets you out of the competitive procurement system, and it's recognition that every citizen is a potential contributor, and the contributory value would be recognized in a direct way. So this is, I'll end with this. This is the kind of things that I'm thinking about as how do we get out of this conundrum that care work is systematically excluded from the idea of what is value. So I think maybe that's enough for my first contribution.
Thank you so much, Michel. Bill, we'll turn it over to you.
Great. I'm Bill Sutherland. I'm coming from Guelph, Ontario today. And by profession, I am a medical doctor. I'm a practicing clinician. My career, I've had a lot of different things. I've worked in general practice on a First Nations reservation to start off my career. I've done emergency and hospital medicine, primarily both in city and rural settings. And now my practice is a primary mental health care, psychotherapy-driven practice. So there's been sort of lots of change and transformation. But before I was a doctor, I was actually, I was a nurse at one point. And in 2003, actually, I was a nurse in Toronto during the SARS epidemic. So it's interesting being here now, sort of in these COVID times, and all of the things that we're hearing about PPE and an alcohol rub and all of these things actually came out of that 2003 period where we really had even more significant gaps in our understanding, when this came through. And so it's really fascinating in these times to watch. I mean, what's different from SARS in 2003 is obviously the scale. We're on a much more global scale, but it is interesting to see how we're all struggling with the unknowns and the emerging unknowns that come out. But as to where to go with the conversation today, just as one sort of thought before I dig into an idea, I was thinking when the invitation came, Katie, you were talking about peer-to-peer, and just recently I was thinking in a very fundamental way, the virus itself is the original peer-to-peer communication structure. And not even ironically, I mean, fundamentally, if you actually think about it on a systems or on a much more broader global level. So if we go up to an abstraction called life as a whole, well, actually, let's give an example one lower. So the kingdom of bacteria, right? So we have all of these species of bacteria. They have this amazing communication strategy called plasmids. So regardless of the species, they have this ability to share genetic material with each other through these little packaged groups of RNA and DNA, which they can pass off. And of course, this is the source of our microbial resistance that we're seeing towards antibiotics today. But an amazing communication source that is freely shared, information freely shared through an entire kingdom. And of course, this is a kingdom of competing species, that often they're commensal, but at any given time, just like anything in evolution, they're competing for their certain niches. But if you look at the role of the virus, not just us against the virus or the human relation to the virus, but the use of the virus within this thing called life as a whole, it very much acts like a plasmid. I mean, it looks like it mimics our own internal types of communication when we look at how cell to cell through things like exosomes and the like, that we can actually branch these things off and we can communicate within the body. But we recognize that in some sense we've externalized that as the living, and we've branched this type of communication out into the environment such that we can speak and share between living to living. And in that regard, we recognize that up to like 50% of our genome is probably of viral origin. The mechanistics and the workings of our entire nervous system, how an axon delivers its materials, is likely viral in origin and viral in design. So, it's an interesting thing. So as we're talking about this notion called peer-to-peer, we have these biological exemplars already out in the field. Now, the one thing that the virus shows us, though, and this is an interesting thing, and I'm just sort of riffing here, but maybe it has an application to peer-to-peer, is that on one level, the virus is incredibly prolific, and I think we can call that, we can abduct that, and by analogy, call that creativity, right? The virus mutates, it interacts with, thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people, and it looks to see what will come out of that interaction. On the other hand, so we have this prolific creativity, and yet the truth of natural selection and evolution and all of its dictates still live. It has to go through, this creativity has to go through a filter. And the vast majority of these creative viral peer-to-peer experiments will fail. The large majority will fail, but some won't. Some will change, some will mutate. Either the virus will become a better communication system, or us as the living in the receipt of this virus will somehow find a way to change with this. And now this is an evolutionary time, of course, so the scale is much larger, but we find a way to change and adapt in a way that this is useful. And so I don't know, I'm just putting it out there. Maybe there is a sense of a biomimicry that we can utilize these times, and the fact that the virus is the zeitgeist and is on the psyche of all people. And maybe there is an aspect of biomimicry there that we can understand the virus in relation to peer-to-peer functioning and perhaps learn something from that. Anyway, that's just a little bit of an aside. The big thing that I wanted to, or the main sort of thing that I wanted to talk about, was this, when Katharine approached, she says, well, I'd like you, we're going to have a conversation about the political economy and its relationship to health. And I just was struck by the political economy. What is this thing called a political economy? And my first thought is that, my first question is this the right primary focus? And I'm sure there's much focus being, broadly put on this notion of abstraction called the political economy. And then my mind said, well, is there something more foundational than the political economy that holds that? And by my own sort of interest, I guess I consider myself a systems and complexity thinker and an applier, but specifically my school would be what was called second order cybernetics. So the work of Gregory Bateson, Francisco Varela, Umberto Maturana, Heinz von Forster. And there was a great paper. It was very small. It was from a proceedings, but it was a paper by Varela called Not One, Not Two. And it was a type of dialectic that wasn't linear and arrow-like over time. It was actually a circular dialectic, which in many ways mirrored more of the natural processes of how circles birth other circles and the notions of nestings that come out of that, the notions of feedback and iterative loops. And so he had this idea of this cybernetic dialectic that really looked at relationships in this sort of nested way. And there was a way to understand the relationships, and there was a way to understand them as a type of right ordering. So, for example, a very simple one is parents birth children, children don't birth parents. Indeed, those children will grow and someday to become parents of their own, and we see this sort of cycle will turn. The problem is if you invert these two things, you actually go from what is a healthy expression of whether it be an ecology or a physiology or a sociology. If you invert them, you create a pathology. So, for example, I'll go to the parents and children. So parents are supposed to birth and raise children, but we do see in our society all the time, particularly in the context of mental health, where the children are raising the parents. For example, in homes where alcoholism is prevalent or abuse or these different types of things, where all of a sudden the children take on this very mature position, and in a sense they become the holders and the containers for the parents' emotional and mental state. This is an inversion and obviously a pathology, and one that many of us are probably familiar, perhaps in our own families of origins or other friends that we've seen. So this is a pathology because of this inverted state, and my patients have taught me this. And I'm wondering if the political economy isn't a similar kind, that the notion of that focus hasn't become sort of a similar type of inversion. I would suggest, and these words are similar, but I think the right ordering and right listing is to think about the primary, as in analogous to the parent, is actually what I would call the relational ecology, right? What are the set of relations, the sum of relations, and the interaction of those relations in the entirety of the living world, right? So, and out of that, we have this child born called the political economy. But if you mix them, if you put that this is the priority, if you switch it and invert it, we end up with a pathological situation. I spent a lot of time studying and working with elders and healers around the world to understand health and other ways from the perspective of other ways of knowing. And this inversion doesn't happen in ancient and archaic societies and their descendants today. I'll give you an example that, at the end of the Lakota ceremony, like a sweat lodge or, other native groups and traditions as well, they'll say the words, all my relations. They'll be saying the words, all my relations all the time. There's this constant reminder that we are in relationship with the sum of the living world. And we are in this reciprocal exchange. And so part of my first sense is before we talk about practical ideas and solutions, how do we correct our epistemology? How do we look and say, maybe there's an epistemological error here, but epistemologies are difficult things. I mean, we can rationally start to wrap our minds around it, but how do we literally start to see the world differently? And that's a kind of engagement that's necessary to actually change our vision. There's a truism in medicine that you don't know you can only diagnose what you already know to see. We can only diagnose the illnesses as physicians that we actually know exist. It's sort of this conceptual trap, and we're blind to our blind spots. And so how do we find a way into a world that opens up those blind spots so we can see things differently? So I know there's sort of an abstractness in what I'm saying, but I would really encourage that we have to get our thinking ordered properly. And the last thing, I say some examples that have come out of that, just in a pragmatic sense. For example, I love the regenerative agriculture and the permaculture movement. And a very simple notion of this would be the food forest, where they've taken the 7 levels of the forest from the highest canopy to ground cover and all the things in between. And they said, what are the principles? And this is the other thing. This is very much a first principle deductive approach rather than small data and granular incremental sort of gains. When we look at the broader functions, the broader principles of this level, what can we do in our own creativity then, that we can start to humbly mimic, this broader mind, this broader web of knowing. And the food forest is a great example where we can take these sort of natural relations that are at work and find a way that we can create a productivity to meet our individual human needs, but in this proper relationship. Anyways, I'll just throw that out as a first salvo, but hope that has some understanding to it.
Thank you so much, Bill. So Andy, I'm going to ask you to come back in. Sophie will wave goodbye for a minute, and we'll just open up and have a little bit of a conversation about everything that has been talked about here. And I think there's some questions coming in from different social media platforms that we can ask. But I'd like to first just start with getting Susan to react to what she said. She started us off, and so I think it'd be great to have her respond to some things that she's heard.
Well, I heard great, big, deep ideas. Relational ecologies, knowing, thinking, changing our epistemologies with these ideas like virus, but they kind of lead me in the same place. What am I going to vote for tomorrow? What policy should my city council put in that can support epistemological transformations, right? That can support focus on relational ecologies rather than holding up sick political economies that are clearly causing trouble and in trouble themselves, right? And so I guess instead of responding, I'll just reiterate back on the table. What can I do tomorrow politically and organizationally to move towards these spaces?
That is the grand question. Actually, on a recent discussion, we hosted Nate Hagans, who's at the Post Carbon Institute. he kind of articulated that paradox by saying we have two emergencies, the one of a collapsed economy that's harming people right now, and the one of the grand challenge. And it was an open question again about those transitional steps. And I think you really articulated something important just now, Susan, in describing that. What are the steps that can be taken today that create what another young scholar, Kelly Levin at Yale, who wrote about the super wicked problem of climate change. She described, she talked about path dependency in the positive sense. Can we build forward path dependency toward better, more inclusive, truly sustainable outcomes? We often think of path dependency as the enemy. It is, in the sense of that's what creates the brittleness of our current situation. But that paper on the super wicked nature of climate change from 2007, 2008 was really awesome. And she was a doctoral candidate at Yale when she wrote it with some other scholars. So what are the incremental steps? Maybe everyone should go around and kind of offer that. I think you got it. I can't remember if it was Sophie or Katharine. You were describing some of those, and Katie too, some of those incremental steps within communities right now that are creating that sense of example and active solution seeking.
Yeah, I think communities are a little bit easier in a lot of ways than getting it to any level of government, even local government. It's a little bit easier. So here in Kitchener, we happen to have a very good local government. And so it's easy to talk to them and to bring in ideas regarding this. But then when you get to our provincial level, it's quite conservative. And then the federal level, again, it's very hard to make any of it understood. But very recently, I had a conversation with Peter Victor, who wrote the book Managing Without Growth. He's a leading ecological economist. And he said, what we need to do right now is look at all of the good things coming out of the pandemic and all of the bad things coming out of the pandemic, and figure out how to keep the good and get rid of the bad. And that's probably the most effective and efficient way of finding the kind of policies that we need. So, for instance, people are having increased time for new skills and learning languages and more family time and reflection. But on the other hand, there's a lot less time for many people, particularly those caring for children and vulnerable populations. And a lot of the pressure has been put on people who are in the care economy to hold things up and give other people that time. And so how do we give people more time without having all of these bad things that have come with it? I mean, one very quick example is have a 4-day work week. That's something that could be implemented immediately. Allow people to work from home forever. The CEO of Twitter just said that everyone that works at Twitter is allowed to work from home now. Why can't everyone? If you don't need to be in the office, why be there? I'm only able to be on the screen now because my husband is taking care of our children. If he was at the office, that wouldn't have been the case. And so there are, if we can look at those and make those connections, I think that we can find these policies that are already available in ecological economics that we could bring to keep the good.
Yeah, there was a comment that just came in from someone going by Dilettante Ventures, but saying, I would argue that caring can be scaled, but horizontally, not vertically. This gets to that question you've just been discussing about the top-down aspects, regulation, law, and the side-to-side aspects. They do interact, though. Ultimately, some of the great experimentations in climate policy have come from the local level, state level, city level, upward and outward. So maybe there's a way to see that connectedness to get some of those brittle regulatory structures transition that way. Michel was just raising his hand.
Yes, I would argue that this connection to the horizontal and the vertical has actually always existed. So if you look at the New Deal in the US, for example, most of the policies of Roosevelt were actually taken from the local level. He was, basically looking and asking about successful experimentation on the ground, which then became national policy. So I think that the example that I gave, with Bologna is a good example. This is a protocol. And I think we should be thinking in terms of protocol. Once we have a working pattern in one place, this kind of pattern can be copied and can scale. And first, it can scale horizontally. And so one of the things that I'm working on is, because I recognize what Katie says, which is the difficulty of working at the nation state level. because it's very removed from the people, and it's subject to an enormous amount of power pressure from the financial sector. But cities, for example, are already much closer to their populations, and if you have a riot in a city, that's very serious for the city. So they're more sensitive to pressure. And so one of the things we can think of is using cities as transnational, translocal, global governance mechanisms. For example, one of the points that I'm pushing is that mutualization is the best way to lower the human footprint. So once you mutualize, let's say, associative or cooperative car sharing, I'm not talking about Uber, of course, but actual neighborhood-based sharing. Like I did a study in Ghent. You have a neighborhood, they decide to purchase 10 cars for the whole neighborhood. In those kinds of mutualizations, you have one car replacing 9 to 13 private cars. This is a huge impact on human footprint on nature. So imagine that cities would create these common patterns, for example, shared mobility, shared housing, and then they would share it across a league of cities. That would be a way to scale these changes without and bypassing the conservatism of the nation state. So there's a lot we can do. Once you have a successful pattern in a particular place, like in Bologna, then the next thing you know, you have 250 cities doing the same thing, and you have 1 million Italian people improving their city to urban commoning. Makers and hospitals, it can be established for all the makers, centers, and all the hospitals, right? So I don't think we should be too conservative in our belief that we can scale. And so that's what I would advocate what I call protocol cooperatives, building shared patterns that are seeds for change. And okay, I'll stop with this, but just want to give you an example. Take permaculture. Permaculture is very local. And maybe in Toronto you have 20 or 30, who knows how much you have. But they're everywhere in the world. So that pattern, which may seem local, and people are very engaged locally in their patch of land, so you have everywhere in the world. So I do think that is actually represents change, even if it's more invisible to in terms of scale.
That's fascinating. Were there other reactions among you about that? There's several things there that popped up for me. And this, I do want to get back to the role of technology and facilitating exactly what Michelle was talking about. In other words, cities being able to be in touch. I know in the Northeast here in the United States, several states started to collectively deal with the issue of getting the health technology where it needed to go, even with the failure of the federal government. And so what's the role of all this connectedness? It's what we're using right now, a force for this kind of transition. Obviously, it's still all designed mostly to capture our attention. I've had many sessions on here previously about the downside of these connected technologies. What would be the processes that would make this all more feasible? Would be something I would throw at each of you. And Bill, you had your hand up. Maybe you wanted to.
Before we moved on, I just wanted to have a little reply to Susan's comment, if that was okay, her initial one. There. So Susan, I think it's important. What do we do tomorrow? What do we do in terms of an expression and application? That's not just all abstraction. I noticed when you first started talking, you mentioned about a conference that you enjoyed where there was dancing and chanting and embodiment at academic conference, and you're like, wow, this is a really refreshing, wonderful feeling, this notion, that embodiment could come into something like this. And so to honor what you were saying, right? So if we actually create that sort of circle within a circle, again, just as I did with the idea of a relational ecology versus a political economy. On one level, if we have this sort of parenting place called aesthetics, and it births a child called pragmatics, right? What I would say is we don't want to put pragmatics before our aesthetics. We want to have our aesthetics before our pragmatics, right? So then the question, what the actions that I do, and I agree, actions are paramount. And what I would say, they're so paramount, but the action I would say though is we're not doing an action that we already know what will come out of it. It's not knowing then acting. We're actually in a much more fundamental conundrum, which is we literally have to act to know, right? And we're in a place that, so this is a notion of feedback. We don't know ahead of time what these actions will do. Unintended consequences, great successes. But all we know is that the only tool we have is we have to act so that we can further learn, which we must make sure we have that sort of notions of feedback. But what can we do to guide our action, right? We can really say, well, where's that coming out of? And I'd like to think that my actions are coming out of something that I would call like an aesthetic impulse that has a sense of beauty to it, at the very least. I can't know its outcome, but I can know its form in sort of some sense. And part of that too is just I've got a sense of an emergent faith in something called self-organization, right? So if I act from a beautiful place and I act to know, and I keep feedbacking and moving those forward on those learnings, and others are doing the same, that I'll never know necessarily what they're doing. But if I can promote this broader sense of coming from an aesthetic or beautiful place in our actions, then what is the self-organization that comes out of it? And I'll just give you a very just small example. Like in the midst of all of this, I took this time in the midst of COVID, and I'm turning 50 this year, and I said, there's stuff I wanted to do as a kid and I've never done, and I've wanted to learn about wild foraging and getting food from the land and identifying plants. And so I went out there and said, okay, what is this relationship into the big green and the big brown of spring? And it all just looked the same until I started asking questions, things that attracted my eye, a beautiful plant, a beautiful flower, looking for the notion of something to eat. And all of a sudden, just like going to a new school and getting to know the other kids at school, I started to get to know these things, right? And there was fears to overcome, but right now I've got, red belted polypore mushrooms at home and turkey tail mushrooms and, tasting wild ginger and wild leek, but identifying them and not just going, oh, sure, pragmatically, is this stuff good for my nutrition as a doctor from a functional medicine perspective? Absolutely. But relationally, it's been far more important for my health. When I go in there, they look at me, I look at them, I know them, they know me. Oh, there's poison hemlock. That killed Socrates. I'll respect that one, and it happens to be growing by the nettle, right beside the nettle, the most deadly plant in North America and the most nutritious, side by side. And me as a third, right? So there is practical, absolutely, we want to embody this in practical senses. But if it is not deeply relational, and I would say if it's not beautiful, if it doesn't have a sense of a deep aesthetic, and we put the pragmatics first, I think we're just going to get into trouble of these endless unintended consequences. But if we really give notions to what that impulse is, and then form our pragmatic choices, which we don't get to know ahead of time what's coming, but we have to do them anyway. And that's all I was saying is that, you're right, there is a marriage of it. And we could talk hours on specifics of what that could look like. But I just wanted to bring out that I don't want to minimize the relationships of our doings, but not, I don't want to have doings at the expense of our relatings. And bringing always the diversity and richness of those increased numbers. And so that's the other thing, act to increase diversity, act to increase relationship, right? I think that these are fundamental notions that all of our actions should do. If they cut, they're probably not wise. Anyway, I just want to bring that because I thought it's an important, she brings up a point that just helps to complete the circle. And obviously we need that completed circle, not just a portion of it.
Yeah, and if I can link that, to embody what we want and the role of technology, right? Because technology isn't the root cause of humanity's objectification of nature or our disconnection from one another. It's the result of the relationships with technology and the political economy that it's within that encourages separation from one another in nature, right? So this doesn't mean that using technology necessarily can disconnect us from one another or has to be about mindless entertainment or about profiting off of us. It can help us in a couple of ways, reducing the energetic cost of society through peer-to-peer networks, and at the most optimistic, also embracing an approach to knowledge and economics based in this peer-to-peer, so it can help reorient our ethics in a way that is more consistent with being ecological stewards and connected to one another. So right now we're asking people to live their lives sustainably in a world where the common sense is closed access to knowledge and education that's made to make little workers, and where we're disconnected from one another. But we're still in this modern world that has technology. It's all around growth and individualism. So with peer-to-peer, you can sort of reorient the way that we think about these things. It's more about the collective evolution and collective way that we start to think about education, and we start to think about knowledge and think about healthcare. It's a collective capacity to grow. So that corresponds with the collective capacity to live well. So if the point of tech now is to innovate for the sake of profit, then our interactions with technology and how we use it in society will mimic this. It's selfish, disjointed, withholding. But if the point of tech is to connect us to one another and create knowledge for a community by the community, then our interaction with technology and one another will mimic this as reciprocal and sharing and cooperative.
Interesting points. I was just, my internet failed there. I don't know if you guys stayed connected while I dropped out and came back on. These are fantastic discussions. There's some interesting parallel ones. The Garrison Institute here in the Hudson Valley has been hosting a Pathways to Ecological Civilization set of meetings. And the same dynamic is there. I'm hoping to see how much we could expand this conversation. The one thing Katie will remember this, and Katharine and Sophie also. We were talking about how the value of using this internet connectedness is that we can break silos and disciplinary barriers, and you can create a community around an idea, as one of the commenters put a few minutes ago too, that can transcend some of the brittle structures we have in the thought world too. Because if you don't have farmers talking to technologists, talking to economists, you won't get at that innovation that Michelle was talking about, or you might get it locally, but you'll never have the value of that ramification and reverberation that can happen here. So that's what excites me in this process. And that's why I was really excited when Katie came back and said, can we do another one? And I'd like to keep this going forward. So maybe it would be good for each of you to articulate who else could be in the room as we, who's missing here, who could make a difference in scale and make a difference in some of what Bill was talking about with that ecological wisdom, physiological wisdom building into these concepts. Who should we reach out to for the next set of conversations? We have more to go in this one, but maybe it's a time to think about that too. And I'll write down those names, or you could talk about it briefly now before we go to the next set of questions. There's some really good questions and thoughts that came in on in the comment string, so we can explore those too. So who should be here? Yeah.
I'd like to learn from people that are in differently vulnerable positions from myself. And I noticed in the beginning, I think it was Katie said COVID found fragile hosts, preys on the most vulnerable in our society. And I think that one of the wonderful things about pandemic or epidemic is that even the most privileged people like myself aren't safe unless everyone's protected, right? Even the most vulnerable. And I actually wanted to share a dilemma I'm working on that maybe you have some insights. I see in the paper that men are dying in far, far great numbers than women. In many contexts, twice as many men are dying as women. In the past 2 months, I've gathered up about 30 articles, publications that say feminist or gender response to COVID, and almost none even mention that. Basically, they say women always suffer more because women are more nurses. They'll suffer more because women are home caretakers. But when I struggle through the data, I see sanitation workers, truckers, taxi drivers, farm workers, meat packers, who are in all the far majority men rather than women, those are already the most lethal occupations. And then they have been the ones who are now most vulnerable. And they're what some people label sort of subordinate masculinities, right? Men that are intersected with different racial. And the last piece to the puzzle I'm looking at are the sort of ecosystems which are highly gendered. Clearly, in most countries, let's just say in North America, senior citizens' homes have more women because women live much longer than men on average. But other places that are very high infections are prisons, jails, refugee camps, migrant detainment centers, military barracks, which are men living amongst men, and they've been really hotbeds of outbreak. So my question for you guys is, why did I read 30 articles in the newspaper about gender and attention to different vulnerabilities that are not sort of bringing up these different masculinities?
It's an interesting question. Michelle, you had a contribution?
I have this idea that in politics there is also win-lose and win-win. So in other words, competitive and cooperative visions. And I'll give you an example that I often see on the left, for example. So many parties on the left are based on analytics, like we have this analysis of society, this is what is wrong, and therefore this is what we have to do. And a lot of the dynamics in left political parties are about competitions for the right analysis. So in other words, it's a scarcity game. And they keep splitting. And, I was used to be a Trotskyist when I was in my 20s. And we used to say, you put two Trotskyists in a phone booth and you have three factions. So, these kinds of dynamics breed this kind of, factional politics. And I think quite a bit of feminism is in the same competitive mindset, which is, like if women suffer, that means men are not allowed to suffer, basically. So you enter into this competition game when recognizing that the other suffers as well is seen as a threat to the power position. And I think this plays a lot. I have the same reaction as you two when I hear about war. I've heard many times people say women and children suffer more in war. I have my real serious doubts about that. I mean, it's the men that are dying on the battlefield. Millions of them in World War II and World War II, and it's the wrong debate, right? Because they suffer in different ways. I'm sure that if you have to take care of your children all alone and you're hungry, I mean that's suffering. But if you're in the in the trenches, that's just another kind of. So I think we should really be careful about not thinking in terms of politics as this kind of win-lose, and that's what I like about the commons, is that there's a common love of a shared object that creates unity around a positive construction. And so I think that there's a lot of things we avoid when we're commoning. And so I want to make an important point. If we are commoning, we have a particular state of consciousness. If we are engaged in markets, we have another particular set of forms of awareness, and they can coexist. You can be a very good family man and be a mafia leader, right? And in the one context you are behaving in one way, in the other context you're behaving in a different way. And so by augmenting the place of the commons and the forms of awareness that are created by commoning, we can alter the centricity of our culture, right? Move from the competitive behaviors that are promoted by capitalist markets to a different kind of feeling about life. So I think this is a very important thing. And then as commoners, we start creating institutions that work for us. For example, one of the big things that I stress is, what kind of markets can work for commoners? A lot of what Katie said in the beginning about, the enthusiasm in volunteering is captured by extractive forces, right? And you could actually argue that capitalism today is a direct extraction of cooperative behavior. In other words, they actually promote peer-to-peer in the commons as long as they can control the context in which it happens. For example, our attention, and then extracted attention as a commodity, right? So we have to create generative market forms. And I want to give you a positive example because I know this can be done. That's what happened in the Middle Ages in Europe. There was a surplus in the countryside in 11th century. The farmers went to the cities and they created guilds and they created contractual commons. So they created the free medieval cities that were run by coalitions of guilds. So in other words, that kind of market with the notions of just pricing and all kinds of things that went with it was an attempt by commons-oriented people to create a society that fit with their values. And that's why we have capitalism, because the merchant class kind of extracted itself out of society and created a state and a market that fit with their interests. So for me, this is what we're doing right now, is that we're trying to create a world around us that fits the values that we experience as we are commoning. And this is what technology is allowing us to do. That we are creating a lot of commons, even with the extraction and with everything. A lot of people are experiencing what commoning is, and we had forgotten about it.
I think, and that gets back to a point that someone mentioned a few minutes ago, which is just that idea of the experiencing that general concept, whether it's at the local level, regional level, city level, then expands the realm of the imagination. Over and over in early discussions on this webcast, I had top national intelligence people on here who said everything that's happened here is because of a failure of imagination. In the negative way. We're not envisioning the negative outcomes that could have spilled from this virus escaping, propagating across species lines and becoming a global disruptor. The same failure of imagination seems to impede what can happen at the global scale. And so here you're talking about, it's kind of like working a muscle you haven't worked before, So I do think, and then that gets me back to, let's say, academia, or other forms of learning. What can we do to maintain and enhance that property going forward? And one other thing I want to throw in, and then I'll be quiet for a while, is what you were saying earlier struck me so much. I'll throw this little thing up here too. The vision you've articulated could spill easily into libertarian and some conservative worldviews, independence, community values. This is sort of the positivist kind of libertarian approach to, if you have an ethical, moral grounding, you can have individuals run around and do stuff creatively and share, that's separate from capitalism and the other ideas that co-opt a lot of that part of our communities. But is this post-partisan also? So now I'm going to be quiet and go at it. Maybe young people first.
I know, Katharine, you have some thoughts about this, so I'll let you go this time.
All right, I just want to respond to Andy's first question about the university and what's the role there. And I think this speaks also to what Susan was getting at, and Bill as well, with this question about pragmatics and policy and strategies. And I think that we really need to, within the academy, completely rethink the way that our education contributes to solving global problems, because we know that the university system is kind of broken. Most people who are in universities are there because they want to be able to get jobs. And I think a lot of the kind of pure learning portion of a university is sort of gone at this point. But at the same time, so we need to have that kind of pure research and knowledge somewhere in society, but we also need to be interacting more and forming coalitions and networks that are outside of the academic space, because academics aren't always the ones who know how to put these ideas into practice. And if we need to be learning to know or acting to learn, as Bill was talking about, we need to be doing that with others, and it needs to include activists at the local level and policymakers within government and people working in health systems and people experiencing vulnerabilities. And we need to start breaking down those barriers and silos, or else we're never going to get there. Like, it's not going to be, the policy approaches are not going to come right out of the people who are developing these kinds of ideas that cross scales. They need to come out of a collaborative working together on these challenges. So that's my piece. I know it didn't speak to that post-partisan space, but perhaps I'll let you do that, Katie.
I mean, it kind of did, right? Because it's the same sort of idea that we need to. It's a little bit more complicated when we talk about breaking down barriers in conversation in politics, because it's become so ideological that it's hard for people who consider themselves quite liberal to accept that they might agree with someone that considers themselves to be quite conservative. But there's a lot of, green ideas that do link with conservative values, and that's a good thing. I think the question is how to gain from that, right? Like, it's not, I don't think making a new political party is the right question or is the right answer, because then, splitting votes, etc. Getting people to move one side or the other, I'm not sure, but there's definitely a lot of overlap there. So I don't know, Sophie, do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, certainly. I definitely struggle with the role of the state in this conversation, especially living in a place like Canada. A lot of my colleagues advocate for a grassroots approach that emphasizes the local and democracy. But the scale at which we need to change remains extremely broad, and the timeline that we have to act is short. That being said, the state, especially in places like Canada and the States, they have this extreme history of violence and oppression. So I'd love to put it back to our guests about what role they see the state as playing in regulating these actions.
Yeah, if you don't mind. Yes, so the concept that I propose in terms of politics is what I call the partner state. So my vision of the state is that in any class society, you will have a state. And the mistake of many, anti-state people is thinking if there is no state, then everybody will be equal. But if you go to countries with weak states, you see actually the opposite occurring, which is, private violence extracts, and it's actually much worse than a monopoly of violence. So I think what social movements have done since 200-300 years is basically domesticating and democratizing the state. That's what the women's movement have done. That's when, gay liberation. We all have actually, we fought for expanding the democratic nature of the state, knowing that it's, originally a violent institution, but it's the reality that we were facing, and that's what what we try to achieve. And so basically, I think that there is no evidence that any other way has worked, because even the Zapatistas and in Rojava, they might claim they don't have a state, but I beg to differ, because they have centralized armed forces. So for me, they do have a state, maybe a better one, but it's still, there's a monopoly of violence in Rojava and in Oaxaca. So what is a partner state? That's basically, a common good institution, in my view, that enables and empowers the autonomy of individuals and groups. So I want to give an example. If you think Google, Facebook, Uber, Airbnb, they're no longer traditional capitalist firms that employ labor to create a surplus. They are platforms that enable us to connect with each other, and then they extract from that, right? So they're already Proudhonian capitalists. They directly exploit human cooperation. Think the opposite of that. Think an institution. So let's take Bologna. Once you have this public commons cooperation protocol, one of the things that could happen is that neighborhoods with privileged people, more educated, more financially well off, might have more time to conduct commoning than people in working class neighborhoods, where lots of migrants and they might be having two jobs just to survive. So it's not because you have commons that you have equality, right? There's a lot of advantages of commoning, but there's no automatic equalizing force in commons. So the role of Bologna as a city is to make sure that there is a commons of capabilities. In other words, make sure that the neighborhoods which are not as able, and they can see that immediately because the number of projects come out of different neighborhoods. So you can see how a city, for example, can play this enabling role of looking, where are the weak points in commoning, and how can we enforce the commons of capabilities of disadvantaged neighborhoods, right? So this is what I see as a kind of a common state, if you like, that this is the kind of role that they should be playing. But the difference with before is, instead of just paternalistic top-down redistribution mechanisms which leave us passive, is that a partner state would actually promote autonomy, so promote self-organization, and so this would be a different vision than the kind of policies that we had for the last 200 years.
Susan, I saw you nodding your head a lot. Did you want to respond?
I love the idea of creating, of using common thinking to change ourselves and to change the way we engage with the state and create states. I think that's a really positive path to move forward.
Yeah, and I wonder, Bill, about how this kind of commons approach or a more localized economy, how that would impact health and the sorts of health systems that you engage with, and what kind of, how these balance, what kind of health systems relate to localized economies and to commons.
That's in comparison to the sort of broader technological type of setting we have. I think in some ways, just if we look at the nomenclature of medicine right now, there's in some sense already two streams of, I guess, applicability. So for example, I think the modern medical system, or the orthodox or the Western system, or whatever you want to call it, the hospital-based system, I think it has a role. I mean, it has a tremendous role, and it has a role that I'm grateful for in my life. My father this year went through open heart surgery for a valve replacement, and required the post-surgery ICU care, and it was something that my father would have died from, and I still have my father, going into this new year, and so I think so. On one hand, what we have, what does it do really well? I think it does the nature of the acute very well, right? So if you're in a car accident, don't take me to my chiropractor, take me to my trauma surgeon. If there's dealing with acute infection and there's not issues with things like antibiotics, there certainly is. But if I'm in the throes of a sepsis of some sort, then I'm glad that is there. Fractured leg, these kind of things. So I think that we do the acute very well. I don't think what we do so well is the chronic, and either the chronic in terms of mental health or the chronic in terms of physical health. And you'll notice that what switches is actually the level of complexity, right? I mean, it's like, we're always dealing with a complexity called the body, but a car accident has a discrete moment, pre and post car accident, and there's the protocols that come out. But mental health doesn't have a discrete moment where this issue came forward. or something like the chronic autoimmune diseases. There's not a discrete moment in time that you say, this is the start of this disease process, because it's interactive. I mean, it deals with the environment, it deals with toxicities, it deals with our genome and our epigenetics, it deals with just so many different interactive types of things. So when we look in any kind of type of situation where health all of a sudden becomes infinitely more complex, and I'm using mental health as an example and chronic illness, I actually think that this is the time where local makes much more sense, right? And we already have examples of this. So for example, people that are struggling with alcoholism will often go to rehab, right? And rehab in a sense are often very locally embedded types of affairs that are, they're very different in their models, driven by, somebody that has a vision to bring these different types of things forward. AA in its origin was a local model, right? Two guys saying, how do we help each other? And so there's something about chronicity, I think, that can lend itself to local. So why don't we have models? Can we have a local model where people with chronic disease, for example, can easily go to retreat for a month, for 6 weeks, and to get into root cause types of things that are very diverse and not just medical in its mindset, back to nature, back to gardening, back to eating. How do we cook? How do we socialize? Do we work, my wife does equine assisted therapy, and I use that in my practice as well, like working with horses, so again, there's these relational feedbacks and reflections. So I really think that if what we can look at now is an opportunity, that mental health and chronic illness is actually a tremendous opportunity for us to understand how to localize. And the thing about this is high relational medicine, right? High touch, high relations, high conversation, high communication. And of course, this time is really stressing that, the ability to reach out and touch has been limited. So I am grateful for even this kind of ability to touch and reach out to each other, but obviously it's not the same as touch per se. So again, we've always had this term called the art of medicine and the science of medicine. And the old buildings and universities will always have the medical arts building, right? That's what it was always written. It was never written the medical sciences building. It was the medical arts building. And I really think that there is a role that we can be deeply scientific, not just both, and again, with the power of reduction, but become scientific with the notion of complexity and systems and these broader thinking, and come back to the art of medicine, right? Which is relational, and it is this type of dance. And it's also a medicine where the patient teaches the doctor, as well as the doctor helping to instruct the patient, right? I mean, we start to co-learn together as we go through these things. So I envision that, I'm not anti-technology. I do think that that's going to always play a role and a needed role. But again, I actually think it should be, it's not the primary, I think it's the secondary. The primary is how we actually hold, maintain, and step into our health. And I think that there's actually, very much in this, the COVID epidemic is actually giving us an opportunity even more so, I think, when things settle, to really reconceptualize, what is health, given the shock that we're just going through.
Well, that's such a valuable point there. I just took Katharine out of the window just because we can only fit 6 in at a time. And I wanted to bring up one arena that a lot of people have been grappling with that you touched on in that very context. As I wrote on the comment, you've made this incredibly important distinction between the acute and the chronic, between the big and the small and distributed, which is also big, but in a different way. That goes back to what Katie was talking about when we were talking to Katie about agriculture, global dependence on food systems too. Some stuff will be big. There are certain commodity crops that you can't grow efficiently in your backyard. Soy it has to come from somewhere. And the other thing is end of life, though. I live a few miles away from the Hastings Center in Bioethics here in the Hudson Valley, and they are one of the great institutions digging in on the dying part of living. And if there were ever a demonstration of the role of that, what Bill was articulating, a very variegated landscape of ways to deal with that, culturally attuned, not technological. Sometimes the worst thing you want there is a lot of technology. The United States still is so far behind many parts of the world in death with dignity laws. And we're all experiencing that through some connection to some elder who is in an isolated situation right now. So that, I think, thinking about that end of life care, the way we care for people, the role of things that are not technological, gives you a great example to think about going forward. And that can be spread and better appreciated too. Great point. You had a couple more comments had come in. Let me just go back to the comment thread. Steve Quilley out there has been interesting. There's a bunch of comments from him. For the local to thrive, it needs a boundary that requires state regulation, protection, compulsory local and national service, communitarian spaces created by a ascriptive model of citizenship. Looking forward to a hug, Bill, when you get back in July. I guess he's someone you know.
He's actually mine and Katharine's. He was my PhD supervisor, and he's currently Katharine's PhD supervisor. And this panel sort of came out of a conversation that happened with him a little bit, because he's very much in support of breaking down the intellectual barriers between things. And I think if Katharine could come back, you can switch me off. Yeah. I mean, she can really link in what he's talking about with what Bill is talking about in for these different kinds of health systems and local systems.
Hold on a second. I'll take myself off for a minute.
Hi, thanks, Katie. Yeah, so in response to what Bill is saying, I think it's obvious that we don't, as a society, want to get rid of high-tech medicine or acute emergency medicine. That would be a disaster. We want to preserve these kinds of gains that have been won through the innovation of modern medicine. But we're in a good position, not saying that it's going to be easy, but the consensus is sort of that health care accounts for about 20% approximately of health outcomes. And that a lot of the kind of proliferation of pharmaceuticals and medical tech contributes very little in terms of actual quality of life gains, but it all is, bound up with the kind of profit motives of medicine. And so we could step back and create a less complicated kind of health system and much more relocalized health system that would deal with a lot of the kinds of conditions that aren't that don't fit with a real traditional medical model. And I think what Steve is often pointing out is that some of that relocalization intersects with kinds of conservative values around the importance of family, often motivated by religious concerns in a more traditional way, and that there are both conservative and green agendas that actually align in that local space. But it makes people uncomfortable to recognize, as Katie was saying, that their views might actually be quite similar to the ideas of libertarian or small c or even large c kind of conservative. And I think we just need to, I don't know how we do this, but we do need to move beyond that discomfort or move into wrestling with that discomfort together. Because if we're looking at sustainability goals over the long term, we're not going to avoid that confluence of these two different interests. It's going to be central to the world that we're creating together. But I think that if we believe or think that limits to growth and ecological constraints are inevitable, then the future is a post-growth world. So we're going to have to wrestle with that tension. And it's not going to be an easy tension to reconcile, but it's something that needs to be part of our thinking going forward, especially in health, but across all of the domains that our speakers have been talking about today.
Yeah, and I also, thinking about these and connecting it back to the commons, I was thinking about 3M and how they have all these patents on face masks and stuff. And I'm hoping that when we get to the vaccine, who's going to own that knowledge and what's that going to look like? Who's going to create it? And I'm not sure the best way to say companies can no longer own that information. Is it the state that has to make that a law, that you can't charge, people in the States, they pay hundreds and thousands of dollars a month to afford diabetes medication. Is that ethical? No, they should have access to it. And there's, of course, other systemic ways to engage with that I know, Katharine, that you talk about, that, changing lifestyles to decrease instances of diabetes, but people are still going to have it. And so you still need to have access to these kinds of vaccines and these medications without the patents on them. So I don't know if there are examples worldwide. Michelle, you might have an idea of this, about medicine and patents that somewhere where they allow it to be free?
Well, of course, historically, the example was polio, which was immediately put in the public domain. But one of the things where policy would be important is, it's a very simple rule, is that anything that's publicly funded cannot be privatized. So if we as citizens have paid for it in public research funds, then there is no ethical justification to then privatize that publicly funded knowledge and then withhold it from people, where we have to pay again a second time to have it. So I think this is where politics still has a big role, because it can, have these new regulations which are commons friendly. I think not Stiegler, what's his name? Yeah, Joseph Stiegler, Stiglitz, sorry, the Nobel Prize winning progressive economist. That's one of his proposals, is to reform again the health research around these public domain coalitions, directly creating public knowledge. I'd like to make one little intervention on the local issue, if you don't mind. So the principle that we promote in the P2P Foundation is called cosmo-local production. And the basic rule is everything that's light should be global and shared, and everything that's heavy should be localized to the level of, realistic level. So we call it the subsidiarity of material production. Not everything can be localized, but some things can. And if they can, it's thermodynamically advantageous to do so, because we spend 3 times more transporting things than making them, right? So by localizing, we can enormously, again, lighten the matter energy load, the human footprint. And I want to give you an example how this works. So we have in Europe now 120 micro factories. So these are not maker spaces, not co-working spaces. These are actually real economic spaces where craftspeople come together. They look for some old factory they can take over, and they organize themselves around cooperative and open source principles. So it's very local. These are people working with steel, wood, 3D printing, all kinds of things for local clients. They want to make a living. But all together, they work on what they call the invisible factory. And the invisible factory is the result of all their designs, where they're sharing in the whole network, right? So what I'm trying to say here is that there's no contradiction between the global and the local. You can be very local and make things, but your design, why should you keep the design for yourself? You can share with all similar people doing similar activities, and so the learning is enormously so a good example of this practice is the biourbanism, which comes from what's his name, Christopher Alexander, right? So he distinguishes biopathic and biophilic patterns in architecture and urbanism. And so what they start describing as a global movement is what these patterns are, how they work, how they can be learned from. And this is a good principle, because this is now being applied in education and communication. I was visiting a Salesian school 2 years ago, and they had a Salesian pattern language on education. So these are all techniques that we can use to be global and local at the same time. And if you don't mind, one more thing. It's about the political thing, the partisanship, right? I think for me, it's quite obvious that the political system is a mirror of the business system. So we have designed our politics as a competitive game, and partisanship is really a logical consequence of that. If you want to win, you have to destroy the other side. You have to minimize the other side. So it creates this kind of logic where partisanship becomes stronger. But we can have other forms of democracy. For example, in Austria, they have these citizen councils, which is now, every law that is voted by the state of Vorarlberg is submitted to like a jury, a citizen jury system. And these people are randomly chosen to be representative of the whole population. They're not partisan. They're just ordinary people inviting experts and then making up their mind as the meeting goes on. So this is not a partisan system. Another example is liquid feedback, which actually none of us is purely progressive or conservative. Most of us are mixed. We have, maybe I'm for monogamy, which is conservative, and then I'm for for degrowth, which is progressive, for example, right? This is entirely possible, right? Many people are like that. The political system forces us to choose one or the other, and we choose the ones that we dislike the least, basically. But in liquid democracy, you're basically allowed to delegate your vote on a micro level. So I can say, okay, I trust Katie because of her expertise in public health. But I delegate my vote on ethical issues to Sophie because I know she's been thinking a lot about abortion and stuff like that, right? So again, this is not necessarily a partisan technique. It allows us to be who we really are, which is pluralistic beings. So I think the partisanship is actually a matter of design. It's not a natural, same with Facebook and YouTube. They do everything they can to polarize us. It's written in the algorithms because they know that the more we emotionally upset, the longer we stay. So nothing of this is natural. This is all designed because of certain material interests.
Yeah, I love that idea of the liquid democracy. It's quite interesting. And I also just, again, I mentioned them before, but I want to mention them again, is open source ecology. They have this global knowledge that they make available to everyone so that you can do this local production. And it's a very good example of what you're talking about, Michelle, of empowering that process. Andy, just before you jump in, I think Bill wanted to respond to something earlier, I think. Yep. It's fine. Maybe not. Okay.
Well, there's plenty to explore going forward. I think that, again, this is chapter 2 of a big book. I wouldn't say it's a never-ending story. I think I expressed that question before about incremental, distributed. What is the capacity for incremental change? That, as Susan said, that first step you can take right now. That feels like so many things that Michelle just articulated. Each one of those could be a session of this discussion. Microfactories. I've already done work on the idea of citizen juries, even in the Midwest and Minnesota and some conservative parts of the United States. There's a group called the Jefferson Center, which started in around 1970, which I think really is one of the foundational forces behind citizen juries. And they've been doing what they call rural climate dialogues and rural energy dialogues. We could certainly have a rural resilience dialogue around healthcare. What do we want our healthcare systems to look like? What do we want our elder care to look like? Even if our state is stuck with no death with dignity law, what can we do to at least spread the idea that there's different pathways toward end of life? That model, I think France right now is the citizen jury model for climate policy. After the Yellow Vest movement made it clear that you have to be more inclusive. So we're now at that point of a few more minutes before 11 o'clock on the East Coast. Not sure what time it is in Thailand. To maybe wrap up with your articulations, each of you perhaps, and then I'll go off the screen so Katharine can come back on, of a next step. Whether it's, what would you write down as a subject to do another one of these calls on? And maybe Steve Quilley, he pointed to some people. I'm overdue to get the libertarian, sort of constructive libertarian voice in this context too. So yeah, maybe a quick round before we end on what's your big vision, but what's a little step toward it that we can all work on?
We'll start. I mean, the big vision is I work for economics for the Anthropocene and the leadership for the ecozoic, and we want to try and find a way to have a better relationship with the earth. And I think that everything that we've talked about helps us get there. And the next steps, I think, is weaving this together in a way that is understandable to a larger audience and getting that conversation to be a little bit more broad. And again, Andy, I'm sure I'll come to you in another month with a whole new panel of people to try and get them talking. Katharine, maybe you should go because I know you have to pop off.
Yeah, I think in terms of the broad vision for my work, it's about the future of health in the Anthropocene and how are we going to restructure health systems so that they can operate within the limits of a finite planet and also support social equity and well-being at a global scale. And in terms of immediate action, I think we need to, as I said in my introduction, support the kinds of self-organization that we're seeing emerge. And this pandemic is one of the catalysts that I think is going to move some of these strategies forward. And I agree that we need to maintain a sense of global connectivity and knowledge sharing while redistributing a lot of things toward the local scale in order to reduce our throughput. And so in terms of health, we need to be trying to bolster these kinds of local networks and community reciprocal responses to health and care that are already there. It's kind of about creating those path dependencies and making it easier for the system to transition into a kind of steady state that cultivates those and allows for a proliferation of self-organization in that sphere.
Sophie?
Great, thank you. I'd like us all to be, always conscious about both the tensions and the opportunities of utilizing this experience of the virus to mobilize our various research agendas. Corona has often been deemed the great leveler, but there are clear divisions in wealth and in power and in access within and between regions. There was a recent article in The Guardian that says that the virus represents the biggest disaster to developing nations in our lifetime. So I guess my question would be how to ensure that our solutions remain global when much of the focus in most of the conversations are in the global north, the minority world, rather than the majority world.
Thanks, Sophie. Susan?
First, I want to say, Katie and Andy, both of you, everyone, it's such a valuable initiative to convene these conversations in intellectual advancement, but on a deeper level, just for human solidarity and feeling connected and motivated from each other. So I really appreciate that. And I mentioned before, for me, it would be interesting to be in conversation with someone that's not in such a privileged position in this moment. Someone who's more familiar with what it's like to be a man in prison during COVID or working in meatpacking industry or something like that. And I think all kinds of differences. We mentioned already urban and rural, people from different countries in different political positions. It's a hard thing to do, and it's probably the most valuable thing we can do. So more power to you.
Thank you. Bill?
Yeah, just a couple of closing thoughts, I guess. I think I know the word post-growth gets sort of bantered around, and I understand the spirit of it. I think it needs to be supplemented. So when we talk about post-growth, we're talking about the post-growth of a material and consumptive culture and the broken cycles that of consumption and waste that creates. And we're talking about a world of limits in that regard. I mean, when we talk about materiality, we're always talking about limits and about boundary conditions. And of course, the boundary conditions aren't just physical. I mean, Sophie, I didn't get a chance to sort of reply to your question about government, but government in any form, good, bad, or indifferent, and how it changes. I mean, they're always at the very least a type of boundary setter, right? They create the boundary conditions that, and I think sometimes we get caught up by saying, oh, this is a bad government, and not recognizing that there's an opportunity for creativity and change, even within those difficult boundary conditions. In some cases, it might be the greatest creativity that comes forward out of the worst of times and out of the worst of governance. So I think governance is absolutely essential, but it doesn't have to be good governance necessarily to create great change. If we as actors and agents recognize that, we just have to learn to move and almost sort of do a judo or aikido with these boundary conditions that are necessarily there in that position. So what I would say in addition to that post-growth world is that yes, from a material perspective, that's true. We're going to limit growth, but it doesn't need to be this and that from a relational perspective. And I think that point always gets lost, that in a post-growth world, we actually have to have a post, like growing of our relational connections. And like Susan was mentioning, getting other voices in here, getting really being with each other and hearing each other and supporting that nature of really truly supporting a nature of diverse views and perspectives, including competing ones, including difficult ones, including ones that don't feel and fit easy on us, but are still part of that dialogue. And so I think, again, just this idea of building this broader, whatever this world we're going into, if it's not going to be increasingly relational and modeled on those aspects of mind and nature that are already, sort of in this perfectly attuned relational matrix, I don't think we have much hope. So I think the work is how do we put towards fostering those notions and recognizing all the top up and bottom down causalities that are holding and shaping this, but to still recognize even within that, there's a lot of autonomy, there's a lot of sovereignty, and there's a lot of way to act and reach out and receive, in the midst of that. And so, as a doctor, again, those are abstract ideas, but they're actually the pragmatic foundations of the medicine I do with my patients each day, and they'll be the foundations of the work that everybody does in their own passion, from their own place, from their own calling in their day, if we nurture that. So, yeah, that.
Fantastic. Can we get the last word in here from those who have not spoken in this round?
I see my
Michelle.
Okay. Yeah. So I just want to say one more thing in kind of historical development. I think traditional societies were about community, fairly fixed communities, fixed in place where everybody had a role. And then capitalism was a lot about individuality. And I think what peer-to-peer, and this is kind of an echo to what Bill says, peer-to-peer is really relational. So I see peer-to-peer as healing the fragmented individual society, not as a pure return to the old style fixed community, but creating new communities. And so I would urge people not just to think of the local as geographic and the global as digital, but as actually seeing what we're doing here also as another type of locality. If we would do something together, if we would construct a knowledge commons, we are creating a space. And this is not, global scale. This is something different, and it has its own logic. And so I think the future of the world is finding the right balance between the local, geographic, and the translocal. It's not necessarily international, it's transnational and translocal.
Beautiful thought. You just reminded me so much of this community I've gotten to know a little bit around. I'll show you the hashtag farm hack, which is small farmers. It started regionally, but as you said, it's a community. It's a translocal community, and they're trying to figure out ways to use technology and with tradition, meaning getting the most from their soil while rejuvenating the soil, but not in a strictured way. And that capacity is infinitely expensive. Although, as was said here earlier, the internet, still the main structures on the internet that connect us are designed to divide and distract us, not just polarize, but distract. And so it takes work. It's sort of like the same kind of work you do to maintain your body. It's work I'm really bad at, like exercising. So finding a way to have a sustained relationship, creative relationship, spreading communitarian relationship with these devices that we're using, I think is a way to get those communities going forward. And having people like Katie and Sophie and Katharine help spearhead a young scholars push to prod those of us who are older to get out of our habits as well is essential. I'm just thrilled that you've all been part of this experiment called Sustain What. I'd like to close with a little bit of boilerplate. I had it here a minute ago. Sustain What is it's a global online conversation identifying solutions to the complicated, shape-shifting, and epic challenges of humanity's great acceleration, which now has hit a great pause. A prime focus is making sense of and getting the most out of the planet's fast-forward information environment, one Earth system changing faster than the actual environment. This webcast is produced as part of my work building Columbia University's new Earth Institute initiative on communication and sustainability. For the time being, these sessions will be focused on mitigating the unfolding societal disruption and devastation driven by this COVID-19 pandemic. But we'll be dipping into other subjects and solutions when the time is right. And as you could see today, a big focus is how to build forward. One thing I've been saying on Twitter lately is to see if we can banish the word the prefix rebuild, restore, rejuvenate. It's all awfully linked to sustaining the old pattern, finding a way to be pro-generative, to be creative, and take away the narrative capture that can limit our imaginations. What's possible is a vital part of what we're doing here. Thank you so much for being part of this, all of you, including Katharine, who had to leave, and the listeners and viewers who tuned in, especially Steve Quilley. We'll be talking for sure. So thank you all. That's it for this episode of Sustain What. Thank you again.
Bye-bye, everyone.